ba 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 da ba ba da ba 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 da ba ba da ba 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 da ba. All right, you know what? That's hurting my throat. That's the Imperial March, my favorite music leitmotif in all of Star Wars. I get goosebumps every time that comes on. Probably not for the right reasons, though. Welcome to the Cinema Psych podcast where psychology meets film. I am your host, Dr. Alex Swan, and in today's episode, we're going to do a little bit of a different. This is like the year of different takes, different formats, different ideas. Today's podcast, this episode, we are going to focus on a franchise which we've done in the past. But rather than focus on the films and visuals themselves, which is, film is a visual medium, of course, in today's episode, we're going to focus on the music and the psychology associated with the music of a film franchise. That film franchise, friends, is Star Wars. Star Wars. Gotta get that Star Wars. Steve Martin riff there. I love that we're talking about this franchise's music because it is some of my most favorite music. And specifically, we're not even talking about the music that you would normally associate with some movies, which is like great music made by different artists, right? This is not like James Bond where an artist makes a completely fresh song for the intro titles. No, this is the soundtrack, the score that was created by legendary John Williams, who perhaps has some of the most incredible film scores under his belt that you could just riff off regardless. And you know exactly what film. Star Wars, Indiana Jones, E.T., Harry Potter. It's just that it goes on and on and on. And so in today's episode, I've got some great guests on to talk not only about how the music was composed by Williams, but also the psychology in the evocation and provocation of what the music is trying to show you and tell you on screen, the visuals on the screen, right? It's a visual medium, but we have scores, and scores have been around film since the beginning when silent films had orchestras sitting in the orchestra bay of theaters playing tunes along with the silent films, right? Completely separate entities, obviously, with the invention of sound in films. The score then got moved from a live performance to a recorded performance, but the idea of a score matching what's happening on the screen has stuck around, and I am such a fan of this music itself. And there are important things that John Williams did for the 1977 film, which was the first one to come out, obviously not first one chronologically in universe, of course, the prequels. So in 1977, Lucas hired John Williams just to be like, hey, can you sort of give me an idea of what kinds of sounds you would use? But Lucas was actually going to use existing sounds and music for the soundtrack, but instead ended up having Williams just do just a couple of things, and Williams agreed, and the rest is history, right? He wanted, one of the things that I know about this movie is that, and George Lucas has said this a lot, is that he wanted Star Wars to sound operatic. He wanted it to be, he knew that it was going to be a more of a space fantasy rather than the existing science fiction at the time. I mean, this is late 70s, so we already had like almost 3 decades of science fiction of the 21st century in film. And so it was going to be quite different from that. And so he wanted big music. He wanted big fanfare. And I think John Williams delivered that with the main title theme. You know, that big theme. He really delivered on that. And so in this episode, we are going to explore how this particular music, along with, you know, related pieces of music, even from John Williams's own filmography, has played a role in the psychology of moviegoers when they are watching it. And even, I dare say, when they are not even watching the movie, but just hearing the music and playing in other facets. And the last bit of trivia that I'll give you for this before we jump into the episode with our guests is that AFI, the American Film Institute, lists this particular soundtrack, and of course, I would say the franchise itself, with the addition of movies and the prequel series, the sequel series, that it's just grown from here. But AFI has listed the soundtrack from the 1977 film Star Wars, now a Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope, as the best film score of all time. Of all time. The best. It is number 1 on their list of best film scores. And I think you know why. I think you know why, but our guests are going to explain why. So let's jump right in. My guest hosts today are the writers of a fascinating chapter that is the basis for our discussion today. First, a returning guest host, Dr. Jim Davies, a professor of cognitive science at Carleton University. He's an award-winning instructor and is also passionate about the relationship between psychology and science fiction, having contributed to Star Wars psychology, Star Trek psychology, and Doctor Who psychology. And if you want to hear more of Dr. Jim Davies after this, you listen to this episode, of course, you want to listen to the whole thing. He is the co-host of the award-winning psychology podcast, Minding the Brain. And joining us for the first time is Joe Kraemer, a composer who has written music for projects in a variety of media, including long-running franchises such as Mission Impossible, Doctor Who, Space 1999, and Thunderbirds. So good. He has written contributions about music for several books, including The Psychology of Star Wars, which brings us here today, The 50-Year Mission, and The Secrets of the Force. Jim and Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yes, nice to be back.
Excellent. I'm happy to have you on because, as I mentioned to the listeners at the start of the episode here, Star Wars is one of my beloved franchises. And Jim, the last time you were on, and this is a departure from Jim, the last time you were on, which was we were talking about AI, artificial intelligence. which is related kind of to what we're talking about today. There's a lot of shared history with Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and I read recently that Steven Spielberg was the only person to like the first cut of Star Wars back in 1976 or 77 at the first screening. Everyone else hated it. So after the show, we chatted about this particular paper, and I think we're coming up on about a year since that episode came out. So how have you been since then, Jim?
Oh, I've been doing pretty well, publishing books and trying to keep up with the avalanche of Star Wars media.
Oh my gosh. Are we excited for Ahsoka?
Oh yeah, yeah. I've pretty much loved all the just about all the live action TV shows.
Yes, they've been wonderful. And Joe, how's your summer going for you?
It's going well. Did some traveling, saw some family, had a little bit of a vacation, which was nice. And been working on some concert pieces of music of different genres and different types.
Okay.
And then working on some Doctor Who projects. So
Doctor Who, new forthcoming Doctor Who projects?
So in England, there's a company called Big Finish, which creates audio drama adventures using members of the original cast. So David Tennant comes back and does shows. Tom Baker, all the living doctors up to Paul McGann have come back and done it, or up to Eccleston. Eccleston's doing it now.
Okay.
Up to David Tennant. Matt Smith, Peter Capaldi, and Jodie Whittaker have not done it yet, but everybody else has come and done one at least. And they're movies without the visual component.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all the dialogue, it's all the sound effects. There's no narrator, so it's not an audio book. It's like listening to a movie. And
interesting.
I've been training my son in sound design because nepotism, and he's been helping me out with the sound design, and then I do the music, and I'm responsible for the final mix of the whole thing as well. So that's I've been doing Doctor Who for this company and various spin-offs. Like I just did a box set with Adventures of Rose Tyler. That adventures she had between her sort of two major appearances on the David Tennant run. And then Missy, the Doctor's sort of arch rival, Missy. I've done a couple of box sets of stories with her. And I'm about to do a box set with Sylvester McCoy, who was the seventh Doctor. So there's things to keep me busy.
That's a lot. That's a lot. I don't know if I could keep up with that, but that sounds amazing. And your son is how old?
He's 20. He'll be 21 in October. So yeah.
Excellent. So got to keep that Hollywood business alive with the new generation.
And I can afford his rates. So
I love it. All right, gentlemen, let's pivot to Star Wars and specifically Star Wars music. So like I said, the two of you wrote a chapter together, and I assume that the chapter was in Psychology of Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
This book that I introed, and you focused primarily on John Williams' first, what I consider to be immaculate score, but not only that film, primarily on that film, but you included other films, and I will link the paper to the show notes here so people can read along. And you added some elements from the prequel series, although the chapter came out in 2015, so just probably before The Force Awakens, and so we'll address some of the additions to the idea at the end of our chat today, just sort of bring everybody up to speed. But before we jump into the psych concepts and the music concepts that are at the heart of this paper, I wanted to find out how the two of you, a ostensible cognitive scientist and a Hollywood composer, how do you get together and write a paper like this? How did this come about?
No, that's funny because we worked together. We just happened to work together as for summer jobs when we were, I guess, in college.
Yeah.
We
I
both
was
worked at a
19.
place called it was called Soundtracks, and it was a little like karaoke, except instead of performing, you made a recording. So you would pick a song, you'd go in the recording studio, and you'd walk out with a cassette tape. And
I've heard of these places. I think they
yeah,
predate me, but
and Joe, I just met Joe there, and he knew my sister, whose name was also Joe. And
She worked there the year before, actually.
oh, that's how it happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we just became friends. It wasn't actually all that busy. And so there was a lot of goofing around. We still have a lot of recordings of us having a
I
ball
love it.
during the downtime. And Joe and another guy who's still in Hollywood,
Yeah,
um,
Mark.
Mark, they actually, I think illegally, lived downstairs of the store in complete darkness with no windows,
Oh my
and would just
goodness.
come up from the cave to work. So anyway, and we I guess just never lost touch, or we lost touch, and then Facebook came along, and we got back in touch, and we both love Star Wars. I remember talking about Star Wars and the Star Wars role playing game and all that stuff
Hmm.
way back then even. So and Joe had a dream to become a composer and go to Berklee College of Music, and here he is.
Yeah, I was going to Berkeley in the early 90s, and in the summers I was
Okay.
working in Lake George at the studio.
Hmm.
And while I was at Berkeley, even before I'd gone to college, I'd been friends with a kid from my high school. I grew up in a small town where junior high and high school were in the same building. So as a
Hmm.
seventh grader, I became friends with a senior who made films on Super 8
Hmm.
before home video. And when he went to college, his roommate was this guy who's fairly controversial figure now named Brian Singer.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
through Brian, I met his writing partner, Christopher McQuarrie.
Uh-huh.
And I met Ethan Hawke, who was an actor in their little group. And I met Dylan Cussman and Brandon Boyce and a bunch of the people because of
Wow.
there was a whole Dead Poets connection
Yeah.
because of Ethan. And by the time I was going to college, Singer was making headway in LA. He won Sundance Film Festival with a film called Public Access, which then got him uh, the set up to make The Usual Suspects.
Hmm. Right.
And then McQuarrie won an Oscar for the screenplay to The Usual Suspects.
Hmm.
And when I had moved to LA, I lived around the corner from him and I didn't have a car, so he drove me everywhere. And we just became like fast friends. And we realized we had like a lot of shared perspectives on film and film music and the contributions a composer can make to a film. And, at the
Sure.
time, he was saying like his favorite score was Close Encounters and his favorite film was Close Encounters. And mine was the first Star Wars and the music from the first Star Wars. So we had a lot of shared interests, and similar to Jim, Jim and I, we just hit it off. And he has I don't know how much it comes out in your professional life, but you have a really goofy and enviable sense of humor, and that was to me was what I never knew what weird wacko thing Jim was going to do next, especially with some of these cover versions that he would do in the. He took the song "Wooly Bully" and sang "Burning Down the House" over it, which was just bizarre, And I think to a degree we tried to outthink each other a little bit. So anyway, yeah, we kept in touch, and when this article came along, when he asked me if I was interested in contributing,
I was going to ask who asked
yeah.
who. Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
Jim invited me, because he's obviously the more academic and sort of
Sure.
clinical, learned, esteemed sort of professor laureate, and I'm just some schmuck out in LA schlepping trying to score movies. So
Excellent. And so this is a chapter in a big book of just the psychology of Star Wars.
mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
other
they talk about like
contributors.
Darth Vader's mommy issues or whatever. Like
Sure.
there's all kinds of psychology stuff. I actually have another chapter in that book about the droids and consciousness and stuff. So
Yes. I love it.
So I have 2 chapters in that book. One with Joe
I've been trying to find this book in libraries, and I'm probably going to need to do an interlibrary loan on this one because
it's on Kindle for $4, or it's on Amazon for $4.
Okay,
so,
sure.
Maybe we can crowdfund you a copy of the book.
I love it. Yeah, exactly. Because I have been trying to put a psychology of Star Wars course together at my college for 5 years now. But I don't have the time to run it. And I need to put resources together, and I need to have the time to put those resources together. But I mean, you could probably put a course together on just this book. Yeah. So let's talk about the music. John Williams scored this amazing soundtrack, and in the chapter, I think you guys have a great breakdown of the broad ideas and then the psychology of those strategies and practices that John Williams did. And I think I think what the reader could pull from this, and I think our discussion today, is those broad psych concepts can be applied to how John Williams scored this movie. So what I want to first start with is that the main title, okay? Mm-hmm. So the main title is one of those things that to have been a member of the audience at the time, unfortunately the first film predates me, but I remember the first time I saw it, just bam, right in your face. Big Star Wars, big fanfare. So talk to us about the main title and the main theme and the psych concepts associated with this iconic sound.
Okay, well, the first thing is that, like a lot of things, it evolved. The movie begins really with the 20th Century Fox fanfare, which is in the key of B flat. It was written by Alfred Newman in the 30s or 40s. It was the 20th Century Fox fanfare, and it's in B flat, and so they decided that the score, the main title, would also be in B flat, same key.
Okay.
So that the Fox fanfare ends up as a sort of intro to the score. And in fact, certain releases of John's soundtrack, of Williams' soundtrack, actually included the Fox fanfare because so many people felt like it was sort of the doorbell that begins the score. Now there are on a special collector's edition of the original score from '77. There is a bonus track of all 5 takes of the main title.
No way.
Two of which were edited together to create the version that's in the film. And in take 1, there's actually a sort of introductory crescendo chord that would have been over the black,
mm-hmm.
and then builds to the big B-flat major chord when the word Star Wars appears on the screen. So even that sort of magic moment that as little kids we were waiting in that darkness and silence for the big, originally that wasn't how it originally began. But after take 1, I think they decided, no, we'll get rid of that.
Okay.
So it evolved to what we saw. And I think what you'll find with a lot of John Williams things is that he's not afraid to try something, and him and Lucas had the kind of relationship where they could do stuff and it could evolve. So once we get to that big fanfare, what we've got is a sort of 4 bars of like a brassy kind of flourish. Mm-hmm. The trumpets are doing sort of celebratory, the horns are doing a counterpoint to that, and the trombones are doing a third part. And this is all kind of like, the entrance of a king, for example, or the unveiling of a glorious army. It's a celebratory fanfare, and then the theme kicks in, and it goes into like a very sort of 1-2 1-2 militaristic dun 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 dun. And what he does is that's clever is that the melody is an upward. The contour of the melody is up. It's always reaching.
Okay.
So it's bum bum ba 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 bum bum ba 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 bum. But the other thing is that it's sort of off the beat. It's a little syncopated. So it's like bum bum ba 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 bum bum ba 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 bum. So where the pulse is falling, it's around those bar lines, and it just creates it's like tension and resolution.
Okay.
That what you're off the beat, and then you bring us on the beat. Ba 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 bum bum ba bum bum ba na 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 ba da dee dum da da dum, and that melody then goes from the brass. That melody is in the strings, and it's got a soaring sort of sweeping quality that's different than the more strident military theme of the sort of A section of the main title. Okay. And the form of that opening is basically like A. So it's basically we have what at the time was called Luke's theme, but sort of became the overall sort of saga theme.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have that middle part, which, because of the Mecho disco record, I always associate with the robots. But it doesn't really have any specific character aligned with it. That's the da na 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 na. And then we go back to the main theme, and it goes through two iterations of that. One is with the horns, and then with the full orchestra. And then, as the crawl begins to become unreadable as it fades into the distance, that's when we get the score in its sort of proper begin. And we have these sort of dissonant chords that settle down to like a sort of typical outer space chord, which is like a major chord with a flat six on top. So sort of you've got that.
Yeah.
Which is sort of the magical sound of like.
Right. Yes.
And Williams is really leaning very heavily on all of our associations with music right away, right off the bat in those first 2 to 3 minutes.
Yeah, and I feel like because he had always envisioned this to be more of a space fantasy kind of opera, bigger than the science fiction that had come before it. He wanted it to be bigger than
Lucas too.
Yeah. Yes, Lucas, right.
Yeah, that Lucas's original instinct, he went to Spielberg and he said, I'm making this Star Wars movie. I need somebody who understands old-fashioned movie scoring. And Spielberg was like, I've got just the guy, because he had done Jaws and Sugarland with Williams. And, Williams went in, and Lucas's first thing to him was like, I'm thinking of using classical music the way Kubrick did. And Williams said, well, if we do that, we're locked into those pieces. If we write our own music in the style of those composers, then we can do whatever we want with the themes that we create. We can do them forwards, backwards, upside down, fast, slow. And so that's when Williams, sort of won Lucas over to an original score. But again, keeping that concept of, Lucas's thing was, I'm going to be showing the audience places they've never seen. I'm dumping, Lucas loved to make movies. When he made his first film, THX 1138, he said, this is not a film about the future. This is a film that somehow fell into the present from the future. And he was obsessed with, he was obsessed with foreign film. Right. So his idea was, I just want to drop people in the middle of the story without any context. And he said, the music will be the context. The music will be what gives the audience that root in the familiar.
So Jim, why then, after so many years, we're coming up on on 50 years now. Oof. Why? Wow. Just putting a number on that. Why does then this main title fanfare and then the progression into the score give people goosebumps?
Yeah, there's a lot of nostalgia, of course. I mean, it's the kind of thing where everybody on Earth practically knows Star Wars, and so you just have to put the music on, and people get a feeling. And I felt this when I was writing the chapter, but Joe's description of this stuff is so incredibly rich and interesting,
Yes.
and I'm trying to speak to the psychology of it, but in terms of what we've done scientific studies of, and it's so primitive compared to like the on the ground understanding that a composer like Joe has. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it. It's still interesting, but like Joe mentioned the reaching, and I thought that was such a great description of this thing where the notes go higher and higher, but they sort of fall back. So da 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 da, and it gets even, so it goes back before it goes higher. So it's almost like it's
Sure.
I picture it like trying to climb a hill, and you slide down a little, and then you get a little bit higher, and
Okay.
and that is
like
ultimately a really positive, exciting kind of thing. And one thing that we know from psychology is that the mind works in metaphors, and one of the main metaphors, well, when I say that, I mean when we have abstract concepts, we tend to understand them in terms of thinking about concrete things. And one of the big ones is up and down. So up and upward motion and being high, and versus downward motion and being low. This is a very primitive understanding. We live in a world with gravity, and when things are up high, they tend to be more alive, awake, healthy, and when they're down low, they're either dead or sleeping or weak or something like that, fallen over. And that is the theory of why we associate up with good. Okay,
Right,
so there's this big
absolutely.
thing that up is good and down is bad. Now, a really deeper question is, why do we associate high notes with up? And that is actually a little bit harder to tease out. Things that are higher up tend to be smaller. When you hit smaller things together, they make a higher pitch.
Sure.
Your Adam's apple raises when you make a higher pitch. Maybe bigger animals are on the ground and they make a lower pitch. All of that might contribute to why we actually call high notes high. Sometimes when I talk to people about that, they say, well, it's a higher frequency. It's like, yeah, but we talked about high notes long before we knew what a frequency was.
Frequency absolutely.
It predates all of that. And if you look at other languages, we get the same dynamic. What we call low and high pitches might be called light and heavy, young and old, weak and strong, small and large in all these different languages, but they all correspond to the thing that you'd think that they do. The small pitch is the high pitch, and so when we have this reaching, it sounds good. It sounds like things are getting better. Things are struggling, but they're getting better, based on this really interesting metaphor of mind.
And, John Williams did a similar thing in Superman with that reach of,
Yeah.
And what's great about that
music too.
Well, what's great about that is that note, that's the most unstable note in like a Western scale. So it's literally like the riskiest note, the most unstable note, and then he resolves it. And it's like that, the highest note in the melody also gives us this like almost euphoric kind of sense of resolution or landing or successfully flying. And then,
Yeah. And in the chapter, it's one sentence, I think, where you both say that the high pitch or the higher pitches somehow make us also feel good, right? So it's not even that we're abstracting.
Definitely emotional. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not just necessarily abstracting the metaphor of up is good, but it also like makes us feel good, and then you follow, and then after that part or somewhere later, you say that there is no recorded civilization in human history that is not associated, that doesn't have music. So music is essential to humanity, and that's how I read it. I don't know if that's necessarily what you meant by that, but
the way you were phrasing that brings to mind maybe perhaps even an instinctive life-saving measure in human beings, which is that a lion makes a low, threatening sound, and whereas a child has a higher voice, less threatening.
Yeah.
So maybe even in something as primal as that,
yeah,
we've learned that things that are low and rumbly are dangerous, whereas things that have a higher sound are safe.
And they play and filmmakers play with this a lot too, with birds chirping after a disaster of some kind, right? And bird chirping tends to be higher pitch as well.
You'll find like sound designers will put lions roaring underneath motorcycles to make them give the audience a subconscious kind of sense of a threat. You know what I mean? Or, so like the dinosaurs roaring in Jurassic Park might have some mechanical sound behind it to, give us a sense of danger.
We talked a little bit about in a little bit of in the intro about how part of the main theme was referred to as Luke's theme. And I want to just jump on that idea of so-and-so's theme, right? And so this is the idea of a leitmotif. And not everyone does this, but John Williams does this a lot in many of his projects, right? So just going to Harry Potter, we have Hedwig's theme, for example, right? So Joe and Jim, talk to me about what a leitmotif is and how John Williams uses this in the score for Star Wars.
The leitmotif came from Wagner and opera. He was really the master of it, the first master of it, I think. And the concept is that you come up with a short, recognizable bit of music, and it signifies a character or a concept or an element in your story. And, for Star Wars 77, I think there were maybe 6 or 8 that we outlined in the article. Luke has a theme, Princess Leia has a theme, Ben Kenobi has a theme, which sort of grows to encompass the Force throughout the saga. The Empire has a leitmotif, the Death Star has a leitmotif, and certain characters have, the Jawas have a motivic theme associated with them, but it's only used in scenes that involve them.
Right.
There's a wonderful theme for when they get their medals, which he sort of plays some games with in Return of the Jedi. He brings back then, but it kind of only exists in that one scene in Star Wars 77. But what Williams will do, if I'm guessing, based on what I can tell as my own experience as a composer and my own analysis of this work, what I imagine he must do is look at the character and try to sort of ascertain in a maybe clinical or academic way qualities of the character that he thinks the music should reinforce. So in the case of Luke Skywalker, it's that wanting to do more, wanting to be something more than just a farm boy on a desert planet, to have an adventure and rescue a princess. So it's that striving for greatness. Yeah. Ben Kenobi is sort of a relic from a bygone age that he speaks of with a wistful quality of nobility and grandeur. So his theme Williams, I would imagine, strove to compose a theme for him that was evoked that nobility and that sort of sense of a bygone age. The Death Star and the Imperial themes are militaristic in their quality because the Empire is like a machine, a militaristic machine.
So I'm going to interrupt you right there. So what makes a theme militaristic? What makes the music militaristic?
So, like, for example, the Imperial theme in the first Star Wars is bum 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 ba da dum da da dum da da, and it's got snares going from bum 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 ba da dum da da dum, and it's played on brass. The brass is often in triad, so it's like, like excuse my sloppy playing, but that trumpets in that kind of layout sound like the trumpeters in an old Roman army marching along, the Appian Way.
Okay.
The percussion, which is like a march sort of tempo.
Sure.
The Death Star motif is sort of a bum ba ba bum, which is a sort of dissonant note at the top. And whenever we sort of what he did for that was he knew we'd have several shots where we cut to an establishing shot of the Death Star for about 3 or 4 seconds. He needed something short that got to the point. And so this brass thing of, I'm going to guess at what it was. It was something like that. That's not perfect, but it was this 3 chords, and the last one was out of the key of the first 2. And that theme, that little motivic piece, it's not really a theme, it's like a little motivic fragment. He needs to convey to the audience as quickly as possible as much information as he can.
I want to just suggest, too, that part of the militaristicness is the instrumentation, because, Joe, isn't it correct that military music tend to be done by marching groups, so you can't really have a piano or
that's
cello?
True. Right, you don't have a lot of string instruments in a marching band. It's winds and brass and percussion. That's exactly right.
Loud, carryable,
it reminds me of like the scenes that you see for like the American Revolution or something like that, where there were soldiers that were tasked with just having drums, right? No guns, just drums.
Right.
Yep.
Or muskets, I should say. And
then like in the case of Princess Leia's theme, what we have is a damsel in distress in the sort of typical. The structure of the story, she functions as like the typical damsel in distress. What Lucas did that was fresh was by casting Carrie Fisher. She was like sort of the damsel in distress who had to keep rescuing the rescuers.
Yeah, when she's a little short to be a stormtrooper.
Yeah. Williams scores her very sincerely. That's the thing with Williams. He treats the whole thing very sincerely.
Okay.
He doesn't goof on it. And that's sort of what would have killed it, I think, is if, even Harrison Ford had to sort of play it straight. Yeah, he got a few wisecracks in, but he wasn't constantly looking at the audience going like, this is ridiculous, right?
Right.
Whereas, I think some less secure actors may have done that. Maybe because Alec Guinness was there too, and up their game. But John Williams met them at that, and his theme for Princess Leia is sort of straight out of the 1940s school book of writing a sort of femme fatale or love interest kind of theme with this, that sound right there, that chord progression of that's just straight out of like the Franz Waxman Hitchcock school of like the leading lady.
And it makes me feel disarmed. Like it is disarming in a way. Like you're not expecting her to be that much of a badass because you first hear it when she's running away from the Imperials and having to put her message on R2-D2. So how does that play into the music?
Yeah, he voices it. The other thing, like Jim brought up earlier with the militaristic, instrumentation is a very critical part of all this stuff. Mm-hmm. By having Princess Leia's theme in the flute.
Okay.
And like when we first hear it is when she's programming I think we first hear it when C-3PO spots R2-D2 and Princess Leia is kneeling in front of him.
Right.
And it's a flute and I think tremolo strings. And the tremolo strings have a very delicate quality, a very tentative, almost magical quality. And even though it wasn't quite executed that way in the film, in the script, it was very much that C-3PO wasn't actually sure if he saw her, that because there was so much smoke from the battle.
Yeah.
So the music is playing into that. And I wouldn't be surprised if Lucas said to Williams, look, I wanted her to be harder to see, but I couldn't pull it off. Can you help the music make this more of a sort of ghostly moment, these are the kind of things that directors will ask composers to do. For example, on Jack Reacher, I was, asked, well, we're not sure about if there's a love story between Tom Cruise and Rosamund Pike. And so there were some pieces of music we were like, if we want to push the romance, we need some music that will do that. In the end, we didn't use it because, we got responses from test audiences that they didn't want the romance in the movie. But that was a case where a director asked the music to sort of help push or nudge something that the filmmaking hadn't managed to capture to the director's satisfaction.
It's so fascinating. I could spend hours on picking your brain, Joe. But I want to come back to my comment about how especially Leia's leitmotif made me feel. And Jim, there is a section that I think is an overarching section. I know it's just a section of the chapter, but I think it fits with how scores are used in movies, and that is that music is emotional. So why does and we mentioned this a little bit ago, right, with the theme causing goosebumps, but why is it that all of these leitmotifs are different sounds, different instruments? What makes the music emotional in Star Wars?
Yeah, that's really important, I think. And as somebody who dabbles in many arts, art is often emotional, but there's something very direct and special about music and dance, I believe. It's very hard for irony or deception. It's kind of, it goes straight to, what it is. Emotion. Music can play to the sort of the basic emotions. I remember in the first draft of the article, I talked about how psychology tends to broadly put emotions on a two-dimensional scale of what's called valence, which is like happy and sad or positive and negative, and then intensity or arousal. So you can have like a high arousal, low arousal, happy and sad, and a lot of emotions fall somewhere in this space. And I think music can be written to be like that. In fact, there used to be a music streaming service. I forget what it was called, but it actually had a little grid of that, and you could click anywhere, and it would play music of that was either like high intensity and sad, high intensity and happy, or what anything in there.
Oh, interesting. YouTube has, if you want to select the music,
Musicovery it was called. That's right. It was called Musicovery.
Has you can choose like bright or somber or things of that nature. So they still kind of exist, yeah. But
then Joe said, there's more. You could do more than that. It's a little you could do. And he mentioned poignance, which I think is great. A mixture of sadness and tenderness that doesn't exactly fall in this kind of thing. And you can also get humor. You can, and Jar Jar's theme is funny because of the way that the notes relate to each other, which I think Joe can talk about a little bit more. But it's possible to make music that sounds funny, which is interesting because like music is kind of without any kind of reference in the real world, but it can sound funny.
Yeah, I mean, right. Well, like, for example, the Jar Jar theme, Williams does two things. One is that the melody sort of doesn't resolve in a traditional way. It sort of twists and turns and goes in directions you don't expect, kind of like the character. Like the melody sort of bumbles clumsily through the scale. But the other thing is that he has the melody played simultaneously by an oboe, which is a very high, tiny pointed sound, and a tuba, which is a very low, very round sound. And so you get this thing of, like, and just the fact that it doesn't seem to relate to a scale, it's got this weird rhythm, and it's got this contrast in the notes. For whatever, Jim can speak more to maybe the fundamental psychology at work here. My knowledge or experience simply goes to sort of, look, I know these things work to accomplish what needs to be done. Why it works, sometimes I'm at as much of a loss as anyone. Why does playing a certain melody with cellos and French horns in a certain range stir in us this sense of, like, just, love, or, like, grandeur, or majesty, or, that feeling of, like, when you see the Grand Canyon, awe.
Yeah.
They're just certain tricks. And, every film composer deals with this to one degree or another. John Williams happens to deal with it in a way which I like very much, which is like leitmotifs, orchestration, very melodic and musical work. But there are composers who deal with it in different ways. Philip Glass deals with it through repetition and more blocks of things. Stravinsky dealt with it. Stravinsky and Bernard Herrmann were two composers who tended to deal in what we call cellular composition, where they just had little sort of musical tokens that were almost like Lego brick, and they would build the piece out of that. Hans Zimmer deals with things in a more sort of textural, where almost just the sound itself rather than any orchestration or music. It's the sound itself that he's making that he's using to try and, convey an emotion to an audience. And the thing about music is it's not literal, and it's like Jim says several times in the paper, it's abstract. And I think it almost completely bypasses our consciousness.
Oh yeah, I 100% agree that it base primal instinctual, yes, down beyond our cortex. I want to focus on one particular set of emotions, and that is the low emotions. To pull from our earlier chat, part of the chat, the low sounds of the Imperial March. Probably, I would say either the second, perhaps the second most recognizable theme from the movies, and that is played in a minor key, which, as a non-musical person, just a lover of music, what is the difference here and the emotionality from the difference of something played in a minor key versus a major key?
Well, psychologically, it seems to have different effects, and it appears to be cross-cultural. So minor keys are a little bit more distressing sounding, a little off kilter, disturbing, and major keys feel very sure and positive and happy. And this has been found cross-culturally, and also when people talk about sad things, if you measure like what pitch their words are, it tends to fall more into like minor key kind of stuff. You'll see, I've heard musicians deny this. Like I was taking a piano playing app, and it said, "Oh, some people say minor keys are sad, but the song Happy is done in a minor key." And I'm like, I bet if you put Happy in a major key, it would sound different. There is a little bit of tension in the song Happy, like the Pharrell Williams.
Do you actually believe that he's happy?
and klezmer music is often done in minor keys and is thought to be happy. But I think that if you put the things in minor keys, or you put it in a major key, it would feel even more positive than it does.
I would argue, like in the case of certain things, it's context that gives you.
Okay.
To me, as somebody who never attended like a synagogue, hearing klezmer music outside of a context, for me, it always had a minor key darkness, sadness about it, a mystery about it.
Okay.
It did not sound happy necessarily to me. Now, I think if I understood its liturgical context, that my reaction would be different. Here's a great example. Ray's theme in the sequel trilogy is in the minor key. But she is a ostensibly the hero of that trilogy.
Sure.
Now,
yeah.
some of that's a reflection of the times we're in.
Okay.
The what's
Minor
in vogue
times.
now. Well, what's in vogue right now is different than what was in vogue when Lucas made Star Wars, and JJ is a different director than Lucas.
Sure.
J.J.
Yeah.
Abrams. So, very much so, like his theme to Star Trek was in the minor key. The theme he had Giacchino write for Star Trek was minor. There is a tendency now to give your character the Avengers theme is in minor. There's something in the zeitgeist right now where having a hero's theme in the major key is like nerdy or square or dumb or old-fashioned or lame. And having their theme in the minor key makes them epic. Then they're epic and awesome. And I think Williams was facing that. He sort of plays with it because her theme is in A minor. But then he goes to a D major chord. So he's trying to get some light in there,
So one of the emotions that I was thinking of when I was replaying Rey's theme in my head was curiosity. Because the first time we see Rey and the leitmotif of her theme...
Sure, well this is... That motif that he uses as part of sort of the supporting arrangement of her theme. It has a very curious kind of like, I want to know what's going on here,
Yeah.
And that's a thing people just goof on, but I think it's very true, and he actually kind of admitted to this in an article. But Superman, Indiana, Indiana, Star Wars, Star Wars. I think he
Steve
does
Martin.
that. I'm Kylo Ren. I think that there's a truth lurking in there somewhere that he looks for things that are going to resonate with the audience. Because what he needs to do is create a whole new language, essentially, a whole new vocabulary that an audience almost totally subconsciously grasps onto and understands what it means. So it's very direct, and it's very... it's not always very subtle or very... there's not always a lot of subtext to it. But it works. I mean, you can't get much more subtle or unsubtle than...
Yes.
But it works. And you watch little kids in a pool who have never seen Jaws, and inevitably one of them starts making that kind of music. When they're trying to scare their little sister, or their little brother. Dum, 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 dum,
Yep. I still do it with my students who probably have never seen Jaws, but know of it.
What we talk about in the article about Darth Vader's theme, which is really clever, and I do think Williams did construct this way, is that you have a minor scale. That's the G minor scale. Darth Vader's theme is... Right? That's the first half of his theme. That's pivoting between a G minor chord and an E flat minor chord. So these are two minor chords. But the melody itself is actually the outline of a major triad.
That sounds way more uplifting.
And I haven't changed the notes of the melody. I've left the melody unchanged.
Wow.
And what's psychologically, I think part of what makes that work psychologically is that Darth Vader is a human underneath that suit. And that Lucas's, ultimate goal with this trilogy was to humanize Darth Vader, for the son to redeem the father and show that there was a man that could be saved in this suit. And that theme being sort of this minor key theme that has a major key triad buried in it, hidden in it, is almost a literal... It's about as literal as you could get in terms of, a good person hidden in bad clothing.
And somebody on YouTube, I'm gonna play this underneath us here, but somebody on YouTube decided to re-record that in a major key. Thanks, Jim, for finding that for us. And it sounds like a completely different theme, and I think they even called it the triumph of Darth Vader.
The redemption.
Right? The redemption. There we go. Of Darth Vader, where in the original it's I don't want to say dreadful. It's scary. Yeah, it's scary. It's menacing.
It's overpowering.
Yeah,
now, not to split hairs, but to be a bit of a musicologist, they did actually change the notes of the tune. So they didn't leave the melody unchanged. So what they did was they sort of took the idea of it and made a major piece out of it, which is still an effective demonstration.
Okay.
But, they quote cheated a little bit by...
They didn't transpose it directly.
Well, instead of going like... They sort of go like... or something like that. They changed the actual notes of the melody. Again, it's still a valid exercise. But what's brilliant about the original version is you don't have to change the notes to have that major chord buried in the original. May I point out another clever example?
Sure.
Of this kind of thing is the Emperor's theme, which is
with the operatics, yeah.
Right, so it's these low voices down here. Mm-hmm. So the theme is. Now, if you take that and you raise it up and have little kids sing it, and you put it in the minor key, it goes na 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 na.
It does sound playful. Yeah. Okay.
Well, and that's the celebration music at the end of the Phantom Menace. So
it is.
So who won the Phantom Menace? You know who is the Phantom Menace?
I think I did see an analysis of. I think I have watched an analysis of that and how they recreated that particular piece to show you or to subtly signal to the audience that Sheev Palpatine won that whole thing. Yeah, everything is moving according to his plan. Yes,
but it's very subtle because he's got the little kids doing it.
Yeah,
he's hidden it and he's made it a major key thing. And he does a third thing like that with Kylo Ren's theme in The Rise of Skywalker. When,
the last one.
Spoiler alert, Kylo Ren turns good and then is going to rescue Rey. He's got that theme instead of being like... and I'm going to guess here, I'm improvising, but it's something like...
Mm-hmm.
He's taken it and put new chords around the melody to give it an uplifting and sort of heroic quality, which this is sort of film scoring 101 if you're a thematic, leitmotivic composer like John Williams, is you could take your theme, and it's exactly what he talked about in 77 when he scored the movie. I can take them and make them happy or sad or fast or slow or stretch them out or squeeze them together.
Yeah. And they did an interesting thing in Star Wars Rebels, just recatching up on that in advance of Ahsoka. And they played the Imperial March as diegetic in the first season of one of the episodes on the planet of Lothal. They took that music and made it a part of the universe itself. And they made it faster. They increased the tempo of it and made it. I guess they would have transitioned it, but I could be wrong because I don't know the music. But they also made it maybe a major key to make it sound like the Empire is great.
Yeah, I know that they did that in Solo. There was there's a scene where there's like a little commercial on a TV in the background for joining the Empire, and they use the Imperial March as like a recruiting theme. Now, some people balk at that. the truth is, does anybody really think at the end of Star Wars that they're marching up to get their medals and there's no music playing?
Right.
You know what I mean? So if you have to assume it's not unreasonable to assume that the music they're hearing is the music that's in the score. That's Ben Kenobi's theme. So technically, the Force theme exists as diegetic music in the Star Wars universe. If you're going to get sort of hardcore and nerdy about it, you know? I have to say, my analysis of the scores has not stretched to any of the ancillary material. Starting with the holiday special, the Ewok movies, the droids and Ewoks cartoons, all of that stuff to me exists outside of what even Shadows of the Empire, Obi-Wan, you know, the Williams' contributions to Obi-Wan are good, his contribution to Solo is good, but to me those exist outside of the core 9 movies.
Okay,
for me,
fair enough.
It's psychologically. There's so much material now that to try to analyze all of it, you know, and the pitfalls of trying to score, you know, 100 episodes of Clone Wars. It's a much different task that Kevin Kiner faced than John Williams faced, and to try to expect the same kind of standards for that is just crazy. You know, it's 100 hours of material versus 12 or now 18.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I did want to just focus on the core movies, and that's all right. So my last question to you both, and Jim, I'll start with you. What was your, because how much later I suppose they came out, and the fact that George Lucas wasn't necessarily involved with the sequel trilogy, what is your brief analysis of I know we briefly talked about this, but brief analysis of the sequel trilogy. Did it fill you with the same sense of emotion, same sense of wonder? That's
no, but I also haven't seen it.
That's true, right? Yes, that is.
I'm always it's sort of my standard answer to when people are like, "Oh, board games today aren't as fun as board games as a kid." Like, you were a different person when you were a kid, so I'm sympathetic to composers of new things, but I've been quite impressed with a lot of the modern music in the Star Wars world. I listened to like an hour and a half podcast about the Andor music that was just very, very interesting. So yeah, I mean, I thought it worked. I didn't find the music ever distracting, which I think is like there's something to be said.
Okay. What was the central piece of the Andor music experience for you? Because for me, it was the spycraft of it, like
So the music, the themes of Andor apparently changed throughout the series, and there's music. There's diegetic music, a lot of it within the show. They use sound to communicate, and so it just seems to be a very tightly woven piece of art with the music in the Andor show.
Excellent. And Joe, same question on the sequel trilogy.
Yeah, I mean, like Jim, I'm not 9 anymore. So, like, the kid that saw Star Wars when he was 7 he doesn't exist. I mean, he's buried in me somewhere, like maybe like a major chord and a minor chord body. But, I was aware of that when Phantom Menace came out. It was exciting I never thought George Lucas would ever make more Star Wars movies. You know, that 13 years between Jedi and Menace, like, eons. It's mind-boggling now that Phantom Menace is older now than I think Star Wars was when Phantom Menace came out. You know what I mean? That's the passage of time as I get older, it rockets along. And of course my reaction to the sequel trilogy is going to be different. I'm always aware of the fact that it isn't the London Symphony at Abbey Road like the sequels were. It's not like the prequels were. It's not George Lucas at the helm. It's JJ and time the sequel trilogy came out, I had the good fortune of doing Mission Impossible at Abbey Road with, some of the best musicians in London. So I had my own sort of, by then I was almost like, well, I would have done that. But not so much, not so much that, I guess, exactly. But, I had my own opinion about how I would tackle certain... Working on a movie is like working on anything else. To a certain degree, it's problem solving. And how you solve the problems is how you differentiate yourself as a composer. How do you solve the problem of making an action sequence exciting? Well, I do it this way. How do you do it? Well, so John Williams will do it with ostinato, which is like a repetitive figure in the string. So dun 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 dun.
Duel of the Fates is my favorite.
Yeah. So John Williams will use that. Hans Zimmer might do it with drums and electric guitars. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then Philip Glass would do it with a totally different way. So everybody has a different way of, quote, solving the problems. And I can hear, and I believe I can hear a difference in styles of directors from the sequels to the prequels and original films. Mm-hmm. Similarly, with the new Indiana Jones movie, I can hear that it's Spielberg's not behind the helm. And maybe it's my imagination, maybe I'm reading into things, because certainly Empire and Jedi feel like part of the Star Wars to me, even though they were different directors.
Right,
But I do feel like in that sense that it was almost like a television series where Lucas was the showrunner. Vince Gilligan is the showrunner of Breaking Bad, even though he didn't direct every episode. I still feel very much like Empire and Jedi are George Lucas projects, even if Kirchner and Mark Wahlberg directed. Anyway, so back to your question. I think that, when you're grading on a curve of, when you're grading just John Williams' work, maybe the sequels are not the pinnacle of his career. But when you're grading his work based on the work of everyone else working today, I still think it's miles beyond what anyone else is doing in film music. Personally.
Yeah, I will agree from my fan perspective of listening to John Williams music for 30 plus years. So, and I don't have the same kind of experience with the original trilogy that I do with the prequels, because I saw them on VHS.
Right.
So it's a different experience to see them in the theaters. But then I went and saw the prequels in the theaters, and I was one of the few who really enjoyed Phantom Menace. When people ask me whether or not I like Phantom Menace, I'd be like, but they've grown. All three of them have since grown on me, and I think the music plays an important role in that, right? There are significant storytelling issues with Phantom Menace, and maybe some choices on Jar Jar Binks. But to me, the music brings it back to a good film. I just said the Duel of the Fates is my favorite.
To me, I always think people always sort of act like, George Lucas should be crucified for the prequels. And to me, it's like, look, I love the Beatles. I also like Wings. But I don't think Wings is the Beatles, Right. Well, the first three Star Wars movies are like the Beatles, and the prequels are like Wings, And the sequels are like Beatlemania,
I love it. I love it. Well, on that note, gentlemen, I want to thank you both for joining me, Joe Kraemer and Dr. Jim Davies, for our discussion on Star Wars music and the psychology of that music. And so, one last time, if you want to tell the listeners here on my show what is going on, anything that you'd like to plug, let us know.
Yeah, sure. I'll
go ahead, Jim.
I'm just want to pitch my podcast again, Minding the Brain. Me and a neuroscientist every month talk about some topic and have a lot of fun. So if you like psychology podcasts, check it out.
What was your most recent episode?
Most recent episode was on animal consciousness.
Ooh, that's relevant for my interest right now. Excellent. And Joe?
I have a box set of adventures with Rose Tyler coming out on Big Finish. It's bigfinish.com. I did the music, and my son and I did the sound. I hope I didn't monopolize the conversation too much, Jim. Thank you for your patience with me and my long-winded answers, and you too, Alex. And
we're good.
I'm holding out hope that Lucasfilm will call someday.
Well, you know what? They're gonna keep cranking out properties, so yeah. Just keep that line open. Thanks again to both of you. I really appreciate you joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks, it was fun.
And that's going to do it for this episode. Until the next one, thanks for listening.